Okay, so today we are dealing with the 2005 Steven Spielberg movie Munich, basically taking its title from the massacre at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972, and then some fictionalized events based on actual things in the aftermath of that.
Well, it's based on what's called Operation Wrath of God, which to this day, people who claim to have been involved with Wrath of God and Mossad and the Israeli government itself, they differ on how much of that operation is actually existed, how much of the stories that people tell about it is accurate. Because the movie Munich is based on a book called Vengeance, which is about Operation Wrath of God. But I mean, yeah, even to this day, Mossad and the Israeli government say that his description is accurate. But some of this stuff did definitely happen. Like there were definitely Mossad guys killing terrorists after the 1972 Olympic massacre. But how many and to what degree is a matter of contention.
Yes. So actually, though, similar to what we did with some episodes earlier this season, I do want to go back through and give a brief history of Israel and Palestine, which is obviously going to be one of the more daunting ones.
Okay, so this is part one of a 70-part series.
For real. So obviously, historically, like old, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, biblical times, this part of the world is where the Jewish people first kind of identified their space, and kind of this is where they were concentrated, but this is where they quote unquote started. And so they felt a lot of ties to this, even as then over the centuries, they kind of became more dispersed and weren't as concentrated within this part of the world as they previously had been. So Christianity comes and actually becomes a major religion in the areas. Even after the Muslims come in and kind of even take over, it's still kind of a majority Christian region, and then eventually becomes a majority Muslim region in about the 13th century. And meanwhile, Jews are kind of, they've been persecuted for thousands of years, so they're kind of struggling to find a place to call their own. They, end up in pockets of Europe, but then kind of get, pushed away there. We've talked about places like the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia, where they, again, were kind of allowed to concentrate, but were definitely, abused is not a strong enough word, but harassed. And then actually they spent a lot of time coming then even back to the Ottoman Empire, where the Muslims were largely accepting of other religions at the time. And so that was even a popular place, which of course then leads to an increased population in the Israel area and the whole Arab world at large. Then you also see them heading over to the United States, which is known for its religious tolerance. And then they do kind of, as you get into the 18th, 19th century, coming back into Western Europe, that's a little more accepting of having them around. So the biggest shift, though, is around the end of the 19th century, and you start to have this call, where you kind of basically, when you start to have these Zionist movements, and the Jewish people who we've just kind of mentioned have spent 2 millennia just becoming disparate all over the world, there's kind of a call to, well, let's go back to our, quote unquote, promised land of Israel from back in the day. So there's no Israeli country at this time, but the Ottoman Empire is mostly okay with them being around, and they kind of start moving back. Then as you get into World War I, this ties into a lot of stuff we talked about during Lawrence of Arabia. So as you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing and the Arabs want their autonomy away from the Turks as that's happening, and then Britain ends up in control of everything, and because it has a good relationship with the Jewish people in Western Europe, they basically recognize, as World War I is coming to an end, that we want to make sure we set up a home for the Jewish people in Israel. And what is set up at the time, basically they're taking the country of Palestine and giving half of it to Israel. But again, calling it the country of Palestine is a little misleading because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So basically the Palestinian region gets split between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the Jews are like, this seems cool. And it basically kind of just is a rough peace for a few decades until following World War II, and you have an even greater influx from Europe into Israel, and the deal that the Britons set up in 1918 is basically set to expire in 1947 and 1948, and Israel declares itself, basically, the British have lost control post-World War II, and Israel now says, so instead of this being a British area where both Jews and Muslims live, the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's now the Brits are like, we're out, and Israel's like, and we're a country, and the rest of the Arab world is like, no. So the war that basically immediately has everyone in the Arab world against Israel, kind of surprisingly, Israel wins. So even though they're this small country with everyone against them, they succeed and actually take over more of that area that was originally designated for the Palestinians. And then now what we've seen since then is just, 7 decades worth of conflict. And the Palestinians are recognized by actually most of the world. I didn't even realize that. Since we're in one of the countries that doesn't recognize them, most of the world recognizes Palestine as a sovereign nation. We're just part of the few that don't. But of course, it's all of North America, Japan, Australia, and Western Europe. Those are the groups that we deal with most that don't recognize Palestine as a sovereign nation, but the rest of the world does. And then, of course, you have all kinds of issues with the areas that were supposed to be designated for Palestine, Israel, because they have the military might and they're in charge, have all kinds of settlements. So it's like, okay, we're going to colonize the Palestinian areas. And then you have these fanatical organizations that are basically or terrorist organizations from Palestine that have no other recourse but to resort to terrorism. And then Israel doubles back on punching hard at them. Anyway, that's the conflict in a nutshell. So when you get to the Munich Olympics in 1972, a group of Palestinians, what do they call them? They're the Black Sunday or Black September?
Black September, which is an offshoot, I guess, of the PLO, which is a Palestinian Liberation Organization, and then an offshoot of that organization, the Black September organization, the Black September movement. 8 Black September members took 11 Israeli hostages in the Olympic Village in Munich. There is a kind of like an interesting story as to why this specific Olympics was kind of the perfect storm for this to happen. So you have, obviously the Palestinians are upset because you had the 6-day war, which you talked about before, between Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon fought Israel in the 6-day war. That was in 1967. So that's 5 years prior to this. Also, you have, this is the first Olympics in Germany since the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. That was like, obviously is a huge blight on the history of Germany. Go back and look at pictures of that Olympics. There are swastikas everywhere. There's Nazis everywhere. Hitler is there. So Germany is really trying to clean up their image as far as the Olympics are concerned. Because of that, they did not want to display any kind of militaristic image. So there was no armed security around Olympic Village. There was a little bit of unarmed security, but like they wanted to make it like, open, we're here for peace and love in the Olympics, and,
be as least fascist as possible.
Yes, exactly. Basically, they said the 1936 Olympics, we're going to do the opposite of that. But what that allowed to happen was then 8 terrorists could then sneak into Olympic Village with guns and take a bunch of hostages. So there were 2 hostages killed during the initial assault, and then they started a negotiation that the German authorities did. The Israelis offered to help the negotiations and help with the response to this, but the Germans declined the help, even though Israel had a dedicated anti-terrorism organization in Mossad, and Germany at the time did not. It was basically just cops, just regular cops is who was dealing with this, which is why when you see in the movie they had German cops dress up as athletes and try and do a sneak attack on the terrorists, but they were doing this in front of the world news media So the terrorists just saw them on TV getting ready to raid them and said, hey, don't do that or we're going to kill the hostages.
Right. Yeah, they showed that in the movie too. They're like, we're watching it on TV.
Yeah, exactly. So it was kind of a, in addition to not having great security to start out with, they also didn't have a very well organized response. And there was a lot of pressure from the Olympics to like, hey, let's get this hostage thing over with so we can get on with the Olympics. Like, we don't want this to be this drawn out thing.
Oh, right. Where it lasts a week and we can't do anything. And
right. Yeah. And they resumed the games even while the hostage situation was still going on. So like there are terrorists holding Israeli athletes hostage and competitions are still ongoing like the next day.
Yeah, that would not happen today. It's not even just like the Twitterverse, but just like the whole idea is that's interesting. I don't know where that shift would have occurred. That's interesting that back then they're like, it's kind of the show must go on, and now we're like, we might continue it, but we're going to have the whole world dealing with this first. It's got to be a social media thing. It's like you only had the 30-minute news at night that was telling you what was going on in some newspapers, and so I think maybe your attention span is like, why aren't the Olympics still happening then? I don't know. That's bizarre that they didn't stop.
Well, and for a lot of people, I mean, it's unfortunate to say this, but they were probably more concerned with the outcome of whatever Olympics competitions they were trying to watch than about this hostage situation.
Correct, which is probably why that was where they kind of assumed the public pressure was. And again, that's probably why nowadays, because of social media, everyone would become immediately more invested in the hostage situation because of it would be in their face 24/7. And it wouldn't make sense for them to continue with any kind of competition, at least until it was resolved. And even then, I think you'd take I can see them taking like a week of mourning before continuing the games or something if it happened today.
So the German authorities agreed to have 2 helicopters fly basically the terrorists said, hey, we want to go to an Arab country. We're not going to tell you which one, but we want to go to the airport and we want to leave. So get us a plane and fly us there in helicopters. So they said, okay, we'll do that. What the authorities decided to do was to use this as an opportunity to try and ambush the terrorists, but it did not go well. You see this in the movie. Basically, these 2 helicopters fly the surviving hostages, so 9 hostages and 8 hostage takers, to the Fürstenfeldbruck NATO air base, where they had a Boeing 727 was on the tarmac. It had flight crew on it that were, they were German police disguised as flight crew, but they left prior to the terrorists getting there. So just like in the movie, the terrorists show up, they go to the plane, it's empty. They realize that it's a trap, and then they start being fired upon by these police snipers, which is a generous term calling them snipers because none of these cops had been given any special sniper training or even trained on the weapons that they were using. And they didn't have any night vision and they didn't have any telescopic sights for the rifles. So they are just shooting rifles from the control tower in the direction of these terrorists. They do end up killing 5 of the terrorists, but not before those 5 terrorists, or the 8 terrorists, I guess, are able to kill 1 German police officer and all 9 of the remaining hostages.
So there's another thing too. Again, if this happened today, well, again, history, everybody has the knowledge of history. So, maybe the terrorists are a little more aware of these kinds of things happening, or that an ambush could happen in this scenario. But I feel like, and not to be like, well, the Americans would have done it right, but I just feel like, modern military training, I think like, if they do this and they fall for showing up there and you got the snipers in place that are actually trained on their weapons with, like you said, all the gear they need, it's basically, 9 shots and it's over.
Yeah. Well, and you see this too, honestly, throughout the 70s, hijacking, hostage taking and airline hijacking becomes a popular method for terrorists to try and get what they want. And the responses to it just keeps getting better and better, to where eventually it's like, it's not even worth it. Obviously, 9/11 was a hugely successful terrorist attack. But outside of that, like, for the most part, hijacking airplanes, it's not worth it anymore because they get so good at responding to it. And, you have after this specific incident, after the Munich massacre, you see, organizations like the French stand up GIGN, which is their national anti-terrorism organization. They stand up in 1974. The Germans have GSG9, which is their anti-terrorism organization, which actually, so the Munich massacre ended on the 6th of September in 1972. On the 26th of September 1972, Germany sets up an organization for their federal police force whose only job is to do anti-terrorism. So, basically you have all these countries start to take the threat of hijackings and hostage takings and terrorism in general way more seriously. But, Israel was ahead of the game on all this. I mean, they had Mossad already definitely in 1972.
Kind of a necessity is the mother of invention kind of thing.
Yeah.
Where the countries who had to deal with it the most had already kind of made adjustments, and others were kind of slower to the game. And so, yes, then the bulk of the movie itself then follows the Israeli response. But again, kind of like you were saying earlier with the stuff not being ever admitted to. And so this is basically a fictionalized version of the Operation Wrath of God that may or may not or likely happened in some capacity, because some of these guys were assassinated. So that is accurate. But to what extent it was actually the Israeli government coordinating it, and then the idea that it was just a small team, that didn't happen. It was, multiple teams or more people, and it spread out more, and it wasn't necessarily targeted on just the Munich thing. It had a wider mandate than that.
Yes.
So we can talk about the movie, but it is a fictionalized movie of realistic events, if that makes sense. So it's kind of this, I don't know if we've had a movie that I could really compare it to that we've had in this project so far, where it's like, some version of this happened, but not with these characters and not in this way.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So our main character is Eric Bana, and his character...
Oh, yeah, he's based on...
Yuval Aviv.
Yeah. Yeah. But his name in the movie is something different. It's a fictionalized guy, basically.
Yes. In the movie, he's Avner. And so we'll just kind of talk about the movie, since we don't necessarily know the details of what really happened, and we can just kind of know there was something in this ballpark. So he's put in charge of this team of essentially 5 assassins, and they even kind of make a point of firing him from or having him resign from his government job and do all the paperwork. So if anybody asks, it's like, well, he doesn't work for us. And on paper, he doesn't work for them, and they're kind of paying him through a security deposit box. And so it's very much, this kind of spy assassin movie, and that's the bulk of what the movie is. But they do kind of take a different take, where I wouldn't necessarily even call it an action or an adventure movie of any kind. It's more of a character drama, focusing on this guy dealing with, well, one, just the danger that he's in and trying to get back home to his family, and just, getting to know these people. And then also the whole idea of, I'm okay with this being punishing those involved with the Munich thing, but I don't want this to be, well, these people may attack us in the future, but haven't done anything yet, and I need to take them out anyway, and just the whole ambiguity of that. And they make a big point to not have the innocent bystander, specifically that one guy's daughter, killed. It's kind of a big deal that they want to try to avoid, and that's kind of the bulk of the movie, is him trying to track these guys down while his team slowly gets picked off one by one too, and they may be being hunted at the same time. And it's an interesting film. It is an interesting film, and it's worth watching.
A big chunk of the movie is fictional. A lot of the hostage, the 1972 massacre events are pretty accurate. But even the subsequent stuff, where they're hunting these terrorists around Europe, it does intersect with real life events at a couple points. You see the raid that they go on in Lebanon, where they dress up as women with the dresses and stuff to be able to get close to the PLO guys. That really happened. They show the hijacking of Lufthansa 615. So that was where the basically PLO hijacked a German airplane and said, "Give us the hostages that you have from the Munich massacre and let us fly them to Libya, and we'll give you the Germans on this plane." And the German government immediately agreed and gave up the 3 terrorists. So we see that in the movie, but there's also some stuff left out. So Operation Wrath of God, there was at least one time, I think it was in Norway or Sweden.
It's Norway, because it's even called the Lillehammer affair or whatever.
Okay, yeah, where they murdered a guy who wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't affiliated with Black September or PLO. I think he just kind of looked like the guy in the movie they're looking for. Salame.
Yeah, Salome,
Yeah,
yeah.
Ali Salame, and they killed him, and it wasn't him. It was just like some Middle Eastern guy that lived in Norway. Yeah,
Random dude.
so that they left stuff like that out, but
Which the movie kind of took some slack for. Actually, that's what didn't realize too. Of course, it's not necessarily on our radar, but kind of looking through the Wikipedia page on the movie, there is this was considered very controversial, which is interesting. So a lot of them were even kind of saying they were seeing it as an indictment of Israeli actions, and they're basically saying it's like it was trying to humanize the Palestinian terrorists. And I guess I didn't really read the movie that way. I mean, it's not like you're saying it's not making the main characters the villains, but it is kind of showing there's an
right,
ambiguity. But I almost feel like the criticism is denying the fact there's any ambiguity. It's kind of what we talked about a million times before. We would never justify the terrorist actions of the Palestinians, but to live in a world where you pretend that the Palestinians have no cause to be angry just seems to me to be completely
right,
naive and disingenuous. And so the criticism kind of at the movie, I don't think is necessarily valid. Now, sorry, I have criticism about the movie,
sure.
and we can get to that. But as far as what they're dealing with ideologically, to me, it felt like it was handled pretty fairly. Or am I being naive?
No, I mean, I would say if anything, they kind of by the violence that the Mossad guys are doing against, then these terrorists, because you have like, Daniel Craig basically gives that because they're talking about, like, isn't this bothering any of you guys? I think it's their documents guy, the old guy in the group says, he's like, oh, sometimes I just have to sit back and remember that, what we're doing here, like we are actually killing people. And Daniel Craig basically has this monologue where he's talking about like, I don't care about anyone except for like Jews and Israelis. And these Palestinians are these PLO guys. They're killing Israelis. They're killing Jews. So I'm going to kill them and I'm not going to feel bad about it. And the way that it's portrayed is you are sympathetic to their cause. We are going to kill these people. We don't care if it's extrajudicial, whether we see evidence that these guys need to be killed. We are going to kill them because we believe, well, not even we believe, our government tells us that they want to kill Jews. So better safe than sorry. Better blow them up.
Right, and we do see Eric Bana's character having a little bit of misgivings about that near the end, where he actually even straight up says, like, hey, if I'm going to keep doing this, I want proof. I want you to show me the documentation that the people we killed were the people responsible specifically for Munich. And Jeffrey Rush's character kind of says, like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And we weren't using you, but you were doing what needed to be done.
And I don't want any of that to sound like I'm trying to feel sorry for terrorists, because obviously the people that perpetrated the planned and executed the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre, or any terrorist attack for that matter, are horrible. And do I necessarily feel bad if they get killed? No. But I also see where there is an issue with just having secret agents going out into the world and just blowing people up on little to no evidence. If that happened. I mean, for a lot of the stuff in this movie, we don't even know if it happened at all, or a lot of it's fictional anyway. But
yeah, and again, it's just at the end of the day, it's this whole the eye for an eye, leaving the whole world blind thing. It's like, yeah, you both got beef, and it's the Battle of Algiers all over again, where it's the native population wants sovereignty, and they only have one means to resort to, and then the other side, is trying to stop them using torture, and it's like two bads. And I'm not saying, I don't know, we're not going to get into the the nitty gritty of Israel and Palestine.
There's the scene in the movie where they get kind of tricked into sharing the safe house. The Mossad guys with the with the PLO guys.
That was interesting.
And Eric Bana is having a conversation with this PLO guy about the conflict, and they're both of them are like, I want my family to live in the land that is Israel, and I will die, and I'm willing to, die and kill to make that happen. And even if it takes 100 generations, I don't care. Like, I want my family to be there. And that's how they both feel about it.
Right. Which is why I personally have always been an advocate for the two-state solution. Of course, not realizing until today that most of the world does recognize that that's already happening, but then you don't have the Israelis respecting the areas that are supposedly designated as Palestinian and continue with their settlements. And if the Israelis have a right to a homeland, then so do the Palestinians, and we've already drawn some of those borders, and there's a way to... I'm not trying to solve Middle East peace here, I guess, but there's a way to make it work if both sides would just respect the boundaries that have been agreed upon in the past, but then keep getting moved, or they're put in such a way that I kind of watched a YouTube video today where it's like, okay, there's different tiers of the areas, and like, okay, we kind of agree upon this. Oh, but we draw the lines this way. Well, the Israelis now have all the resources. So yeah, the Palestinians got some land that they can have some autonomy in, but they don't have the resources you need to live. Yeah. And just, it's complicated, and both sides are just too stubborn, and there's too much bad blood for them to come to the table in good faith for any length of time. And it's going to continue to be an issue, right? Definitely. I mean, I don't see an end to this, despite, Jared Kushner's best efforts. Hey, I delivered that with a straight face. So, with the movie itself, again, I've never been a huge Spielberg fan on one side, but at the same time, I definitely respect a lot of his work, and a lot of his movies are really good, and I appreciate his role in the history of filmmaking. To me, he's always just too impersonal a lot of the time, and just, he's a great filmmaker, but rarely tackles subjects maybe as interesting as Munich here. But what I remembered from the theater, I hadn't seen this since I saw it in the theater back in 05, 06, whenever, and I wasn't a huge fan. I remember being kind of disappointed that it was nominated for Best Picture. I felt it was just kind of, generic war type, assassin movie. Now, and watching it a second time here, I was more impressed with it. I was like, okay, no, this is solid. This is really good. I get what they're going for here. But then the same scene that stuck in my mind from the theater, I knew it was coming, and it's, I don't know, and you can tell me if I'm missing something here. The ending to this movie, where they juxtapose the killing of the hostages in Munich with the sex scene with his wife, is just stupid.
That's super weird. I've seen this movie probably 5 or 6 times, and I have no idea what they were going for there. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. It's dumb. Yeah. It's just straight up dumb. There's no deeper meaning. He's trying to make some parallel there, it seems, but maybe Eric Banner's character is distracted and always haunted by this thing. Okay, but why are you illustrating that while he's having sex with his wife? Yeah, but it's bizarre.
The way that they shoot it, the way that it's edited, it makes it look like he's having a flashback to that, which would make sense if he was there, but he wasn't there.
Right, and they're almost kind of making it like that flashback to that scene that he wasn't at is somehow turning him on.
Yeah.
And somehow that's working its way into the sex, and I think it's just straight dumb. In my mind, it almost ruins the whole movie. And it's just so out of place. It makes no sense. And of course, again, you think of Spielberg. It's like, how many sex scenes are there in Spielberg movies ever? And then this is the one he chooses to have. And it's just weird.
When you're watching the movie, if you have at least a general understanding of how the 1972 Munich massacre went down, because they don't show it all at once. They show it's interspersed throughout the movie.
Correct.
Parts of the massacre, and so that makes sense. And it's like, oh, okay, when are we gonna get to the airport? When are we gonna get to the airport? And then you're waiting for it the whole movie, and then at the very end, you finally get it, but it's intercut, with this weird sex scene that doesn't make any sense.
Right, and it seems like an easy edit, or you could do those as 2 separate scenes. But I can respect the way they kind of broke that up throughout the movie and built to the. Oh my gosh, I'm just even way I'm going to say this. And then they built to the climax of that incident. I'm like, what are we doing, Spielberg? This is just idiotic. And so the film was nominated for Best Picture, and so it was nominated for 5 awards in total, but didn't win any of them. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Film Editing, and
John Williams
for the score.
Which the music in this movie is really good. It doesn't have a super catchy theme song or something, but
true.
I mean,
it's Spielberg. The filmmaking is great, but it's not a great film. But there's definitely some elements.
I just think it's funny that John Williams, his middle of the road, middling, probably relatively low effort score still gets nominated for an Oscar that year.
Right. And it is ultimately, it's a 78% on Rotten Tomatoes. And, I'd probably put it a hair lower, but I mean, that's probably about right, where it's solid, but definitely flawed, both from a historical standpoint and, again, just the bizarre ending that just kind of undercuts. I feel like it cuts the legs out from the rest of the film that is otherwise pretty darn solid. Yeah, and I don't know if other critics felt that way, but so as far as bringing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the present, in some ways we kind of already have. It's not much different today than it was when this happened 40 years ago, or almost 50 years ago. So it's just kind of a continued conflict with the, Palestinians wanting their autonomy and Israel still being the stronger power in the region, with the United States always as having their back. And again, we talked about before, and we'll get to it as we get more into terrorist activities and the rest of the timeline here. But I mean, a lot of it has to do, I think, with the U.S. openly backing Israel and the Arab world not being pleased with us messing with their world. It's kind of the whole, what right do we have? And yes, we have an interest in promoting democracy in the Middle East, but to pretend that doesn't then trigger Arabs and Muslims in that world to have resentment towards us is naive. But again, we'll get to that as we get more into the future decades here on the timeline.
One thing that I have in my notes, one of the rare comedy scenes, I guess, where Eric Bana is talking to that accountant, and he keeps telling about how I need receipts. And the accountant calls Eric Bana a yeki, which is it's a slang term that means, I think it's specifically, like a German, someone of German Jewish descent. But I think it can also kind of be used to mean just a Jew who lives in Israel who isn't from there. But he calls him a yeki. He says, "I'm not a yeki. I was born here." And he says, "Where's your grandfather born?" And he says, "The Ukraine." And he goes, "You're a yeki."
Yeah, I guess I even missed the use of that term. I couldn't even tell what he was saying. Oh no, you know what it is? I thought he was saying Yankee.
Oh.
And I was like, okay, they're just saying you might as well be American if you're not Israeli, kind of thing. Was the way I was taking that.
Oh, that's funny.
Okay, so next week we're headed to 1973. Munich started in 1972, and then we kind of went into the years past that as they were dealing with some things. But we're going to go to 1973, back to Southeast Asia, where we were to kind of start this season, this time to Cambodia with the killing fields.